What's up guys? Today we will be going over the bow, which is one of the most iconic weapons in New World, and was one of the most used weapons during the preview for good reason. I truly believe the bow will be one of the most used weapons in New World when it comes to open world activities, simply because it has everything you're looking for. Lots of AoE, all kinds of CC, tons of mobility, and the damage to match. The bow has been a favorite weapon of mine for a while, and a perfect match with the spear, which we will go over later. And in this video, you'll learn everything about the bow and what it specializes in, so be sure to watch all the way through. So now, let's get into the bow and see why it'll have you sliding around the battlefield at the speed of light. So, the bow scales off solely dexterity and has two ability trees that we will look at. The first is called Skirmisher, that focuses more on AoE and mobility. And the second is Hunter, that focuses on pretty much pure damage. Let's first look at the Skirmisher tree, which specializes in AoE, CC, and mobility. The first ability is Poison Shot. Shoot a poison arrow that on hit or land creates a cloud of poison 3 meters wide that lasts 10 seconds. Bows entering the cloud are poisoned, dealing 10% weapon damage per second for 20 seconds, which has two passives that increase the poison damage from 10 to 12%, and the second that causes 200% more damage if you directly hit an enemy with Poison Shot. A great defensive ability to create space or force an enemy out of an area. The next ability is Evade Shot. Leap back 5 meters and shoot an arrow, dealing 125% weapon damage, which has two passives that give the arrow you shoot a 2-meter knockback, and the second that gives 15% movement speed for 5 seconds. This ability, in my opinion, is a must-have on the bow. It offers a great escape and the ability to reposition very easily when things get out of hand. The third ability is Rain of Arrows. Shoot a barrage of arrows 7 meters wide that deals 150% weapon damage, with two passives that give Rain of Arrows a bleed for 85% weapon damage over 12 seconds that can stack up to 3 times, and the second that gives 15% slow for 12 seconds on hits. Rain of Arrows will be absolutely annoying to deal with, as it makes it very hard for anybody to engage on you, and it can be used offensively to stop a retreat or force players out of an area. This tree is by far one of my favorites. It offers great damage with a good AoE, CC, and mobility. It actually has close to everything you would want for open world combat, because you will have tons of space to work with, and this tree allows you to utilize the full potential of that space. There's a lot of tree passives that will be amazing to grab. For the sake of time, I'll quickly read them and put the full details on screen if you want to read them. And keep in mind that some of these have been changed. Alright, these passives will give 20% movement speed for various actions, like having 3 enemies within 3 meters of you after a dodge, and 10% movement speed for just swapping to your bow, and 20% damage after dodge. Hitting an enemy below 50% health reduces the bow's ability cooldowns by 5%. Debuffs last 20% longer. Enemies that have a debuff on them take 10% more damage. And lastly, the ultimate, where leg shots cause a 10% slow for 2 seconds. These passives will give you so much room to work with. If you use all of the movement speed bonuses and slows to their full extent, with Rain of Arrows and Poison Shot debuffs, it will be extremely easy to stack on an enemy, and with them lasting 20% longer, you basically just have a flat 10% damage bonus at all times with the Mark passive. So guys, all 100% of you, if you want to see more New World, or just want to be guys being dudes, consider subscribing for more content in the future. So now let's talk about the Hunter tree, that has a focus on pure damage with very little in terms of mobility and CC. The first ability is Rapid Shot. Shoot 3 consecutive arrows, the first 2 dealing 100% weapon damage. The last shot causes a knockback and deals 125% weapon damage. with 2 passives that reduce the cooldown of rapid shot by 50% if all 3 arrows hit, and the second that increases the damage on the 3rd shot by 25%. This ability will absolutely nuke someone if you land all 3 arrows, especially if you somehow hit headshots on some of them. And it's no surprise that this is the highest burst damage ability on the bow, and in my opinion, this is a must-have if you plan to use the bow as your main damaging weapon. The second ability is Penetrating Shot. Shoot an arrow, dealing 150% weapon damage that passes through targets and continues for 100 meters. With 2 passives that increase the damage by 10% for each enemy hit, with a maximum of 50% damage, and the second that deals 20% more damage to enemies that are at least 20 meters away. This is a good ability to have if you plan on attacking big groups of enemies. The big drawback is that it can only be fully utilized in a few niche scenarios. And now we have the third ability, Splinter Shot. Shoot an arrow out 10 meters and then it splits into 3 arrows, dealing 50% weapon damage. With 2 passives that increase the arrows fired from 3 to 5, and the second that reduces the cooldown of Splinter Shot by 10% for each enemy hit. If you plan to AoE farm or plan to partake in crowded PvP battles, this is a decent ability to use. A big downside is that they recently added a minimum distance before the arrows actually separate, to prevent people from running up beside you and just sawing you in half like a chainsaw. And you can see this in the Expedition gameplay we got a while back. There's a few tree passives that are pretty good to grab that give you 20% more damage if an enemy is 10 meters away. Heavy attacks fly faster and do 30% more damage. Deal 20% more damage if your enemy is below 50% health. You take 20% less damage while aiming. Arrows fly 100% further before gravity starts. Headshots will heal you for 10% of the damage done. Your attack's critical hit 10% more often. And the ultimate, headshots deal 20% more damage and you have a chance to get your arrow back. So this tree is great for damage, but the lack of mobility and CC is a huge downside. So unless I'm doing something where I wouldn't need mobility and CC, like DPS and expeditions, I would only use this tree to grab a little bit more damage if needed for whatever scenario you find yourself in. Now I'm sure you can see why the bow is a savage in open world gameplay, and I'm sure you all already got a few build ideas in your head that will help your playstyle, and I'm curious to see what you come up with. So now let's quickly talk about the spear and why I think it will complement the bow perfectly. The spear is a melee weapon that scales off primarily dexterity and secondarily strength. Its 2 trees are Zoner and Impeller. For this video, we will be looking at the Zoner tree as it specializes in AoE, CC, and creating space between you and the enemy. And also, it has a range attack. So let's look at the first ability, Cyclone. A spin attack that deals 100% weapon damage and pushes targets back 3 meters and applies a 50% slow for 3 seconds, which has 2 great passives that restore 25 stamina per hit, and the second activates Grit while you perform the attack, making it unstoppable. This ability is great for pushing people back that get too close, and with the attack being unstoppable, it is a very reliable way to keep your distance, and could be a great setup for evade shot on the bow to create even more space. The second ability is Javelin. Throw your spear, dealing 125% weapon damage and staggering on hit. With 3 passives that add a knockdown on hits, headshots reduce the cooldown by 50%, and for every meter the javelin travels, it gains 2.5% damage, up to a max of 100% damage. This ability does a nice amount of damage, and where I can see it being very useful is to stop players from running, if you could land the attack. The third ability is Sweep. Sweep the target's legs, dealing 75% weapon damage and knocking them down. With 2 passives that activate Grit, making the attack unstoppable, and the second that adds an additional attack at the end that deals 125% weapon damage. And there's some tree passives that play really well with this pair that give 10% damage to consecutive heavy attacks on a single target, 10% crit chance on attacks if the enemy is 3+ meters away. Heavy attacks reduce all spear cooldowns by 15%. Dodging backwards consumes 20% less stamina after a successful hit. Critical hits restore 20 stamina, 25% damage against enemies that are knocked down. Heavy attacks grant 15% damage absorption for 2 seconds. 30% stamina regen when stamina falls below 50. And the final one, 25% damage while stamina is full. They really reward you for using heavy attacks while playing the zoner tree, as you get that 15% cooldown reduction, 10% extra damage, and 15% damage absorption. So if you go with the zoner tree, you'll definitely want to be using heavy attacks where you can. So I'm sure you can see why I went with this combination, as you can stack your attribute points into dexterity to easily get the maximum damage for both weapons. And with all the mobility from the bow, paired with the CC and high attack range from the spear, you will be very hard to get close to, allowing you to slip around the battlefield like a snake hunting for prey. I love making these weapon overviews for you guys to show the potential of the weapons, but I'm curious if you all would want to see actual weapon builds in the future, or maybe even PvP focused videos. If that's something you would want to see, be sure to tell me below. I listen to all your suggestions and try to provide what you want to see. And with that, guys, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching, and as always, have a good one.